Physics of the Sacred based on Chapter 4 of the 13 Petalled Rose, which was entitled Holiness. I'd like to read the first paragraph because it sets the tone for what this is about. It says, quote, "The root meaning of the concept of the holy in the holy language is separation. It implies the apartness and remoteness of something. The holiness is that which is out of bounds, untouchable, and altogether beyond grasp, cannot be understood or even defined. So, being so totally unlike anything else. To be holy is, in essence, to be distinctly other." With that in mind, we're going to be talking about this through the three dimensions we spoke about that have been discussed in other chapters of the book. So please watch, or especially read, the 13 Petalled Rose, but you can watch my other videos summarizing the other chapters 1 through 3, where we talk about the dimensions of time, soul, and space. And we'll go through those dimensions and discuss the holiness. What has happened in modern society is disconnected from the traditional biblical understanding of holiness is that we have domesticated the infinite. Holiness has found its place on greeting cards, in common parlance, and is associated with an extension of a type of behavior that is an extension of what we might understand. But the problem is that when we do that, we mistakenly categorize the sacred as this magnified version of, say, basic goodness or charity or pleasantry. The reality is that the standard physics, as an example, and observational gravity fit neatly into cognitive filing cabinets, but holiness is basically an alien, and one could say extraterrestrial frequency. I like to call it a divine frequency that basically utterly shatters them. I use the word alien here only because I want to emphasize the separateness, the apartness, the fact that this is a thing, a something that is not capable of being filed into what we understand about the world. And how do we understand the world? We understand the world through metaphor. Even science is a step-by-step process of heightening the analogies to such an extent to allow us to understand things. That is essentially what the process of science is. We map the universe through metaphor. We build cognitive bridges from known to unknown. And the mystical architecture insists that when approaching the sacred, you possess zero building materials. There's essentially a lack of analogy. The gap cannot be bridged by stacking human virtues of goodness, charity, pleasantry, as we spoke about. And so the ability for us to understand holiness is different in kind from everything else we experience in life. Which, by the way, doesn't mean that we can't have an experience of holiness. The issue is the understanding. This is a new primary color. We have the grayscale of human virtues, but the absolute separation we spoke about, that I read about in the first paragraph of this chapter in the 13 Petalled Rose, is such that it's a new primary color. There's absolute separation, and it's of a matter of kind, not degree. You're not able to stack enough goodness on the grayscale to reach the new primary color. This is, and when you declare something holy, it's active noise cancellation. It intentionally strips away the static of human labels to tune into a frequency completely beyond human qualification. And we spoke a little bit about this idea of separateness in other chapters, but we're speaking mostly now about the aspect of holiness. The first dimension is space. We spoke about that in other chapters. And space is essentially like ripples from a stone in a pond. Spatial holiness anchors into physical GPS coordinates. And as you approach the absolute center, the standard laws of material reality begin to warp. Where is this center in biblical understanding? It is the Holy of Holies in the temple, which then extends to the courtyard of the temple, and then to the border of Jerusalem, and then to the border of Israel, and then outward into the world. And it is basically an objective map of obligations, in a sense. You can experience holiness, but it is not a feeling. And when you get closer to this center point, there are essentially warp to physics. We have an understanding of this through descriptions of what it was like in the temple, where space didn't necessarily conform to standard physics. One of the stories that comes to mind is when the temple was full, body to body, but people could still bow down, meaning the space was malleable of sorts. And this maximum obligation presented itself to the Holy of Holies when the high priest was entering on Yom Kippur and had to have a rope wrapped around him. If not performed properly, he would essentially die. So there's warped physics that are happening the closer and closer you get. The core generates this intense radiation of absolute separation. And it's strictly barred to human entry. Entering without exact multidimensional alignment triggers a fatal contradiction in physical reality. So the exact center of concentric circles is the physical coordinate, which we spoke about, which exists in our 3D world and higher dimensions simultaneously. That's what makes the Holy of Holies such a remarkable place. And the temple, which is representing sort of a spiritual implement to distribute this out into the world, not that it doesn't do that currently, but not in a reflective way, the way the temple was. It's a functional spiritual machine designed to harness the absolute center of the impact. So we have these eternal coordinates and latent sanctity. The physical apparatus is gone, but the spatial coordinate remains objectively chosen. We spoke about where that is, the Holy of Holies in the temple. And it exists in a state of latent sanctity, meaning there is this eternal pairing Bluetooth signal, essentially, that's happening. It's continually broadcasting, and it's awaiting the machine, the implement, to perfectly complete the connection. That is what makes the temple such a remarkable spiritual implement. But what's really remarkable is that an unprepared ego, as it encounters this unshielded spiritual sanctity, doesn't result in apathy. The ego essentially reacts. And when you do that, there are energies that come up on board to sort of feed off of this holiness, so to speak, and to destroy the demand for surrender. Many people, including myself, I have to admit that when I've been in Jerusalem, it's a very intense, conflicting experience for me, which as I contemplated this chapter again, I've read this book many, many times, I was thinking more about my experience of being in Jerusalem, and the intensity of it is not altogether pleasant, and probably has to do with the fact that even my ego is not even mine. I'm not saying that I have any particular lack of ego. What I'm saying is that my ego also I believe I have an understanding of the intensity of it all and the not altogether pleasantness of it while being in Jerusalem, that there is a certain rebelling of the ego because there is a certain requirement of nullification as you get closer and closer to such a divine energy, so to speak. But even the word energy is not the right word here because we're using a understanding metaphor of the world, which again breaks down in the concept of holiness. So I ask all of you who are listening, if maybe you've had that experience where you've gotten so close, or closer, I should say, to a source of divinity, and part of you reacts in a negative way. The ego rebels. The next dimension is the geometry of time. And in the Western delusion, essentially we have a linear line that moves to an endpoint. But in the mystical reality, time is not a straight line. It is a helix. Rising from the bedrock of creation, we continuously return to the exact same temporal compass points, but at a higher elevation, meaning we're hitting the same place in that linear line in the image. And that is a holiday, as an example. We're encountering the same structural energy of that coordinate, but at a higher place. But so could be said for the rest of our lives, that we are continuously moving in a helix, hopefully up, but possibly falling downward, and encountering similar points on the way down as we circle this center axis. And the 10 Sefirot have a role here. The 10 Sefirot we spoke about is, in a lot of ways, you can think of the prism of divinity as it descends to our world. It's split into 10 different aspects. But time also has this. As an example, Gevurah and Tiferet are Monday and Tuesday, the energies of that, which can be broken down further into the hours of the day. My point here in this very brief, overly simplistic explanation here is that even during the day, we are encountering a sequence of energies that are of divine essence, that are penetrating into our world, which are revealing latent aspects of this holiness. A week is not a sequence of blank containers. Each day, each hour, in fact, physically manifests a specific divine emanation. You are living inside a continuous recapitulation of creation's energetic laws. And where is this really profound? It is in the nullification of the Sabbath. And I love this analogy that it's a weekend agency of blocking the infinite. In other words, when we are in the midst of working, we essentially are blocking the infinite in some ways because we are engaged in ego-driven activities. And of course, there are those who are able to transcend that to make work into a divine play, so to speak. The example of hidden tzaddikim who just with every tie of the shoelace are still connected to the divine. But for the rest of us, we are in weekend agency, not purposely blocking divinity, but through our activities, through our engagement with the ego, through making a living, and not essentially we're putting up an umbrella, blocking the infinite. The nullification of the Sabbath is a hard stop on all physical and spiritual effort if we follow the essence of the Sabbath. And to receive the downpour of absolute holiness, you must close that umbrella. You must drop all active background applications of the ego to allow the universe's operating system to update. I had this discussion with a artist friend of mine who's Jewish, and she paints on the Sabbath. And I spoke about this because the act of creativity is while some could see it as a channeling, so to speak, of some higher aspect, is still a block on the reception of what the essence of Shabbat is. So we must close all active background applications of the ego to allow the universe's operating system to update. That's the other aspect of this, that we are, by shutting that umbrella, by closing that umbrella, we're doing a factory reset. And we're able to receive some of what happened during the week, but also prepare the reset for the coming week, which is really the most important part for me. The rest and the ability to move into the next week with a reboot of the system. We spoke briefly about how the holidays re-access these primal revelations. In other words, as we ascend the helix, the spiral, and we hit those different aspects, just like we spoke about the days of the week, we have a accentuated access on the holidays. They are, in one way, temporal slipstreams that flood the present with ancient metaphysical forces. And as we mentioned, you can slide back down. Transgressions create structural gravity that drags you down the calendar spiral until divine forgiveness restores your elevation. It is I think, amazing and interesting way of looking at the holidays, because it gives us a personal insight and preparation to the holidays. Are we ascending? Are we this year, this holiday, with the energies that are capable of being accessed at this holiday? In other words, each holiday having its unique expression. Are we able to access it even more at a higher level? And that's one way to think about moving into the holidays. And then finally, the soul dimension. Holiness is an external current. The human being can only serve as the conductive wire. The goal is, in other words, holiness in and of itself cannot be generated by you. It needs to be connected to the source of divinity. The goal is to calibrate the behavioral antennae and remove the thick insulation of the ego to let the current flow. So we download the operating system, merging intellectual frameworks via sacred texts. Of course, the prototype is the degree of the connection of our souls with the unique divine expression that is the Torah. Can we remove the clogged pipe of the active ego? Can we shut the umbrella to allow the calibration of the antenna? And part of that is through our behaviors, through making sure we are aware of the mitzvot, performing the mitzvot, being I hesitate to use the word good person, but activating divinity through selfless acts of charity. I think you know what I'm getting at with that. And as we said at the very beginning, that we humans transmit, they become transmitters. They are not creating the holiness. Even the person who is maybe not even aware of God, who is performing selfless acts of charity, not expecting anything in return, are able to access this, even though they don't have the conscious awareness that what is happening is they are becoming a conductor of holiness. That is why selfless acts with no motivation of reward and speaking from your heart to your Father in heaven can elicit such a profound connection that is always available. So even though we speak about the complicated architecture here, it's accessible by reducing our ego, again, as an example, performing selfless acts and speaking with a pure heart to our Father in heaven. Which means that there is the aspect of surrender here. At the highest level, there is total and permanent nullification of the independent will, where you become a chariot. In other words, you have surrendered yourself fully, so your acts are the acts of the divine. Your speech is the speech of the divine. This is at the highest level of human development, I guess you could say. The highest prophetic level, which can lead to speaking in the throat, the divine literally utilizing the human as an instrument of speech. And we've certainly seen that in our prophetic tradition through some of the books of the prophets. And we've seen the other aspect, which is transient prophetic visions overriding the mind for a split second. But the concept to understand here is exactly that surrender is not defeat. And I mention it that way only because we often think of surrender in the Western context as a type of negative. But in this context, it is the ultimate integration. The friction between the human and the universe, between the human and the divine, drops to zero, transforming an ordinary person into a breathing vehicle for the infinite. Amazing. Again, reached only by the prophets, but also at times, of course, always accessible to humans, to normal people. Maybe not recorded, but of course, the access is always possible. So we spoke about the unified physics of this receptivity of space, time, and soul. Space, time, and consciousness are the exact same multidimensional architecture reacting to a single mechanism, receptivity. This emanating Bluetooth waiting for a receptacle. It's always radiating. The only variable is whether you've emptied your vessel enough to capture the downpour, but being conscious of your space, of the time, and of your soul. I'll see you next time when we discuss Chapter 5 in more detail.